my fold. Ah. Our next speaker is Ellen Wohl, and she is a very distinguished speaker, indeed one of the most productive people in our field of stream science. Indeed, she is a university distinguished professor of geology at Colorado State University. She got her bachelor's degree in geology at Arizona State University and her PhD in geosciences at the University of Arizona. She has 14 amazing awards and honors, which I won't read to you. They are truly impressive. And I want to point out that she has advised students for 56 master's degrees and 29 PhDs. She has published 259 refereed articles in journals and 34 book chapters, and has published 24 books already. In addition to that, she performs a lot of services within the profession. There are many of them listed here. I just wanted to point out one of them, that she is the editor-in-chief of the Oxford Bibliography of Environmental Science and has been since 2013. So Ellen is an authority on how streams work, and particularly on the function of wood in streams. She is going to speak to us in her first talk today, first of two talks, on the subject that messy streams are healthy streams. Ellen, let's hear from you.
Okay, I now have a healthy respect for the power of this thing, watching Ray and John work with it. But yeah, I'm going to just give you a little bit of overview on messy streams, which is really shorthand for spatial heterogeneity in streams, and concepts that both Ray and John have alluded to in their talks. If we could just go to the slide presentation format, I'll get started. And another way to think of messy streams is spatial heterogeneity, to be a little more technical about it. And I'm using that to refer to anything that makes a stream differ from an irrigation canal. If you think about an irrigation canal, it's as uniform as you can make it. It's straight, it's got the same cross-sectional geometry, very consistent gradient. The idea is to just get things downstream quickly. Natural streams tend to be different than that to varying degrees. So here we go, let's see if it works. So a little bit of background to understanding spatial heterogeneity. And when I first showed this talk to Ray, he said, can you put in some smaller streams? Because I have things like the Yukon River in Alaska. I want to emphasize that everything I say applies to streams and rivers of any size. It would apply to first order streams. It would apply to the Amazon. The basic principles are the same. But a little bit of background, what we expect to see is very important. It governs what we want and what we think is natural. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Where you are on the earth is critically important. All natural streams are spatially heterogeneous, but to differing degrees and for different reasons. And the big question that both the last speakers have alluded to, what is natural? If we're in this part of North America, is it pre-European settlement? Is it what? If it's not that, then what is it? Is it really intensive agriculture or timber harvest? That's a very much an open question, but it governs what we think of as reference conditions and what we're managing toward. So the shifting baseline of perception, this comes from social scientists. There's two parts to it. One is that whatever you are used to is normal. And the second part is that if the change is gradual enough, you don't necessarily perceive it. And that derived from marine fisheries, where fishermen would say, yeah, the fishery's in good shape. We're still catching fish. But if you had quantitative data, you could see that the catch was going down through time and the fish were getting smaller and smaller. So there were changes that were happening a little bit too slowly and gradually for individuals to perceive. So in the context of rivers, this is the inside front cover from a text on river pollution by a British author. And everybody would look at that and say, it's not good, very bad scenario. What I found interesting was the opposing front cover, which is very bucolic. It's a boy and his dog fishing. But the more I looked at that, the more I thought, I don't think that's a very good image. It's England. And England was completely historically forested. Many of the non-forested environments that they're famous for, like the moors, those are anthropogenic. They're maintained by burning and by timber harvest. So you look at that and you think, well, that's a very uniform width, and I don't see a lot of variability in the riparian zone. I don't see any evidence of bed form, so I'm getting very critical. But the point is, most people would look at that and say, yeah, that left image looks really good. But the more you know about the history of alteration in a place and about rivers, the more you may begin to question some of those assumptions. And I'll come back to those images at the end. And in the context of that, so I've spent the last 2 days with several people in the room doing a field tour, and it's been really interesting because we've seen a certain number of multi-channeled systems. They're often referred to as anastomosing. So you have channels that branch and rejoin downstream. Those were much more common historically around the world. They're very uncommon now because we as people have spent in parts of the world many centuries trying to make them more efficient for navigation or flood control or waste disposal. So we've turned them into single thread systems. But there's a few examples here. The scale bar is the same. It's 300 meters in each of these. So there's some very small channels and some major channels. I'm mentioning this now, and I'm going to come back to it in the talk this afternoon, because this is not something we usually think about for river restoration. We don't think about making a multi-channeled system because we're not used to seeing them, and we may not consider them normal or appropriate. Environmental context, again, the idea that where you are in the world and where you are in a watershed makes a big difference. So a couple of randomly chosen pictures, both of those are quite natural rivers. They have completely different sources of spatial heterogeneity, different processes. So it makes a difference where you are in terms of thinking about context and restoration. And then what is natural? This question came up on our field tour yesterday. Well, where do I find reference conditions? Everything in the area has been altered. You may have to use very indirect sources of information, whether it be the geologic record, which sounds like I'm talking about millions of years, but could be the last couple hundred years in terms of sediment records, or trying to find more natural places in a region that have been less altered recently. But one of the key things here, that first phrase, natural range of variability, natural systems are never static. They may be dynamically stable, but they are never unchanging. So if you go back and you find an abandoned channel and you're using the dimensions of that, say in sediments, to understand how the channels were sized in the past, well, that channel that you're looking at is just a record of an instant in time, and it would have changed. So this is probably the hardest thing in river management and restoration, trying to understand what is natural, the natural range of variability, how land use history has altered those characteristics. And in this context, a lot of times people will look to natural flow and sediment regimes. And I'm guessing that everybody here is familiar with the 1997 paper by Lori Poff and others, where they posited the natural flow regime in rivers. And they described that as a hydrograph in the absence of human alteration. So no dams, no flow regulation, no land use changes that have severely impacted, say, runoff coming into the channel and the hydrograph. That's now really a paradigm in river management and restoration, trying to restore as much of that natural flow regime as possible. And you can take the same approach to sediment. Natural sediment regime may be just as important in understanding rivers. So one way to conceptualize this, when I think about a river corridor or a reach of river, I think about the fluxes moving through it. So there's water, sediment, and in forested regions, large wood. They all have variability through time and space. They're occurring in a context that's really a function of valley geometry. So are you in a low gradient uplands? The picture on the upper right is a tributary of the Yukon in Alaska, very flat environment. The picture on the left is Phantom Ranch in the Grand Canyon, if you're familiar with it, very laterally confined bedrock canyon. So where you are in the network, I think this, yes, the spatial limits here I'm referring to are the lateral limits. Do you have room for a meandering channel or a multi-thread channel, or is it a gorge? How erosionally resistant are those boundaries? And that's partly the geologic material, but it's also what Ray was referring to repeatedly, and John, it's the vegetation, which has a very strong influence, as you know, on bank erodibility and energy dissipation. And then certainly what is going on downstream in terms of the base level. Do you have a channel that's incising because base level has dropped? And base level is the lowest point downstream that controls erosion along the length of the river. So you have fluxes occurring in this context, and that results in a whole series of characteristics. And I've just used a few here as examples. How messy is the river? What's the surface and subsurface connectivity? How well is it able to respond to disturbance, whether natural or human? And how much integrity does it have? And I'm guessing that many of you are coming from biology and ecology backgrounds, so you're familiar with the concept of ecological integrity. Geomorphic or physical integrity is analogous. If you have a large flood, is the river able to adjust, or is it a concrete canal where the water just goes faster? There's no adjustment. So geomorphic integrity is physical adjustment. And all of these occur in a river corridor. That's a phrase that I'm using to refer to the channel itself, but also the adjacent floodplain and the underlying hyporeic zone. And this looks like a very busy diagram, but it's really just showing the movement of water and solutes going through the river corridor. And the key point here is that it's not just simply moving downstream. And this goes for sediment, particulate organic matter, certainly organisms. There's a strongly three-dimensional component to that movement where you have material moving downstream, but you've also got lateral exchange between the channel and the floodplain, and then vertical exchange between the channel and the hyporeic. And if you're not familiar with that term, the hyporeic zone is the area immediately beneath the channel and floodplain where you have water that originates in the stream, goes into the subsurface for some distance, and then returns to the stream. It's sometimes referred to as the river's liver. It's very important for water chemistry. It's very important for macroinvertebrate and microbial habitat. It's a place for denitrification, for example, can help to ameliorate fluctuations in water temperature. It's analogous to groundwater in that sense. It usually keeps the river cooler if you have more hyporeic exchange. So I emphasize this river corridor rather than just saying river, because I think if you are explicit about that, it really helps to emphasize these interactions between physical process and form, those biogeochemical processes that influence water quality, and then the biota, both in the sense of biota responding to physical processes, but also shaping those. And it also makes it, oops, now I did it, more explicit that there are these interactions between the floodplain, the channel, and the hyporeic zone. Okay, so what constitutes messiness or spatial heterogeneity? You can think of it in different dimensions. There's heterogeneity in the stream bed as you move downstream. This is a small channel in the Rocky Mountain National Park, which is where I work a lot. So the log jam here is creating this nice backwater. Most of this channel is a 3 to 5% gradient cobble and boulder bed stream, but here you've got more sand and gravel size material. There's much lower velocity. There's a lot of organic material accumulating there. It's the channel spanning logjam. It's a little hard to see there that's creating that. But you can have longitudinal heterogeneity in sediment, different types of bed forms like steps and pools, or pools and riffles, large wood. You can have heterogeneity in the banks. This is just a very small example, a channel in southern Wyoming. You can see those bank undulations. This could be meander bends, expansions and constrictions, root wads from trees. The point is that the banks are not just straight lines. So that's another source of heterogeneity. The cross-sectional form. If it's not an irrigation canal, you don't have a uniform trapezoidal cross-section. You've got riffles and pools, you have bends. So there's differences in total cross-sectional area and in symmetry of that cross-section. And then looking down on a map, the plan form of the channel and floodplain. So an example here of a reach that's just become a lot straighter because there have been a series of cutoff meanders, but you go a little bit downstream and there's still a lot of sinuosity. So sinuosity, how many channels do you have? Is it braided or anastomosing? These are all examples of spatial heterogeneity. What causes all this? Fundamentally, it's geologic controls. As in the last couple of days, I've heard about and seen rivers that are coming from groundwater fed springs that are really localized by the glacial moraines, other areas where there's glacial lacustrine clays. There's differences in the bedrock in Wisconsin. So there's this geologic template, but there's also the effects of vegetation, and biota here is primarily referring to beaver. It's one of the few animals in the Northern Hemisphere that really shapes river corridors deliberately, as opposed to, say, cattle, which it's inadvertent. But these can certainly create spatial heterogeneity. And then temporal and spatial variations in what's moving through the river corridor. So that water, sediment, and large wood, think of floods, droughts, landslides, or debris flows, those all create heterogeneity. They're primarily acting to create that heterogeneity by moving sediment around and changing the channel configuration. So sediment erosion and deposition, as expressed through things like the channel moving from side to side, either abruptly or gradually through time, or these changes in things like what types of bed forms do you have? Do you have boulder and cobble? Do you have sand bed channels, clay, the cross-sectional geometry, and the plan form? Okay, so a little bit of background on spatial heterogeneity, but why do we care about this? What are the implications? Well, the first one, of course, is habitat abundance and diversity. If you have an irrigation canal, it's all one habitat. So the more diversity you have in the river corridor, the more different types of habitat you have. And as an example, in this case, there's an abandoned meander that's mostly filled in, so it's more of a marsh, a meander that's still got open water, more of a lake or pond environment. Oops, it seems to have just frozen. Nope, I got all of them at once. Okay, I'll go back. Getting a little bit more lag time. There we go. Secondary channel and the main channel looks quite different. And then I wanted to find an example from Wisconsin rather than the Yukon and Central Alaska. So this nice river, I think you pronounce it Embarrass. I think it's a French word, embarras, which means an obstruction. So either beaver dams or log jams probably originally. But I zoomed in on Google Earth and you can see a partly disconnected side channel, one that's still got surface hydrologic connectivity. It's hard to see at this scale, but there's large wood in there. There's a nice pool on the meander bend. So the more heterogeneous the river corridor is, the greater the diversity of habitat you have for a wide range of organisms, terrestrial, riparian, and aquatic. A second implication is resistance and resilience. And resistance, as you might guess, is the ability to resist change during disturbance, whether it's a natural disturbance or human-induced. Resilience, the system may change, but it recovers to a pre-disturbance state fairly rapidly. The other endpoint on this description is sensitive, where you have a change in response to disturbance and it doesn't recover. So fire, flood, drought over short time scales, climate change, resource use over longer time scales. I'm going to use an example from a beaver meadow near where I live. This is the white arrow indicates flow direction. The upper photo, the big hill in the background, is a lateral moraine from the glacier. The terminal moraine is just downstream here. And in these settings in the Rocky Mountains, beaver often find really good habitat, and they build a series of dams that create ponds, and they move around through time. So with time, you end up with this extremely heterogeneous mosaic of environments. There's standing water, there's secondary channels, there's abandoned ponds that are filling in, and this is just at ground level. There's actually 3 channels coming together there in a very dense willow car environment. This particular stretch of the river corridor is extraordinarily resilient. There have been some horrible fires in Colorado in the last decade. 2012 and 2020 were big fire years. And if you look at that environment in the river corridor, the water table is much higher there than it is in other portions that are more well drained. So it's pretty resilient to fire. It doesn't burn. It's very resilient to flood. We had the flood of record in this system in 2013, and the areas immediately up and downstream from here are more like the classic mountain stream. They're steep, narrow bedrock canyons, huge amount of erosion and deposition in those. When I got up here after the flood, I couldn't tell that there had been a flood. The floodwaters came into the upstream end of this dense willow car, and they just lost all their energy. The waters went across the floodplain. The huge hydraulic resistance of these multi-stem plants really limited erosion and deposition. So it was very resilient to the flood. And similarly with drought, there have been a series of studies for both fire and drought showing that these beaver meadows with this high water table are very resilient. So here, spatial heterogeneity created primarily by the activity of beaver and the interactions with the riparian vegetation create heterogeneity that creates resilience. And a very dramatic example from my colleague Joe Wheaton at Utah State. This was a fire in Idaho about 3 years ago now, and the uplands were completely burned, but you can see the beaver modified portions stayed green because of that high water table. So a third implication is retention. And we think of rivers as loadic environments, things flow downstream, but if they flow too fast, that's not good, as you all know, for fish production and a lot of other things. So if you have spatial heterogeneity, that means there's some places with lower transport capacity. There's margins of channels, there's the inside of meander bends, there's secondary channels, there's overbank areas. So you have at least a little bit of retention for everything moving downstream: water, solutes, mineral sediment, organic matter. This is a second order channel in Rocky Mountain National Park. You can jump across it without taking a running start. And that's a very small log jam that probably blew out the winter or the snowmelt flow after I took this photo. But this channel is 5 to 7% with boulders. And right here with this little accumulation of wood, there's this backwater that's retaining much finer sediment, organic material. And microbial ecologists have shown that if you retain organic material, even for a few hours, let alone days, then that greatly increases the rate of uptake by macroinvertebrates and microbes. And there you've got the base of the trophic cascade. So you increase biological availability. If it's something that may be nasty, you may disperse or dilute it in the floodplain and store it there, thinking of heavy metals or chemical contaminants. But the more heterogeneous the river corridor, the better the retention. And connectivity, and I think connectivity is a phrase we're all very familiar with now. You can use it for water, for sediment, for solutes, for organisms. Heterogeneity doesn't necessarily increase or decrease connectivity, it just alters it. And another example from the beaver area, this is an abandoned beaver lodge, but if there was a dam there, that would decrease longitudinal connectivity, but it would increase the lateral connectivity between the channel and floodplain and the vertical connectivity between the channel and hyporheic zone. So different sources of heterogeneity definitely influence different forms of connectivity. So when I think about what we as humans have done, and primarily European humans, we have created what Stan Shum, my predecessor in fluvial geomorphology at CSU, referred to 30 years ago as river metamorphosis. So you all know biological metamorphosis. River metamorphosis refers to a complete change in form and function. And most of what we've done is make naturally heterogeneous rivers more homogeneous. We've simplified them for, again, navigation, flood control, sometimes for aesthetic reasons, et cetera, for a variety of reasons. And a lot of that is driven by the presence or absence of these variations in inputs. We try to control floods. We try to keep sediment out when we have things like landslides or debris flows. And spatial and temporal variations in biota, and trees are the great example. John gave that nice talk about old growth forests. Well, if you pull all the trees and all the wood out of streams, that has a dramatic impact on stream form and function that's very persistent. And since Ray specifically asked me to mention this during the field trip 2 days ago, we've looked at streams in the Western US, in Wyoming and Oregon, that had log floating. There's been no log floating for a century, but those streams are still statistically significantly different than rivers that did not have log floating with respect to riparian vegetation community, age and structure, and with respect to the spatial heterogeneity and function of the river corridor. So there's a long lag. When you stop doing something, it can take a century or longer for the system to recover its heterogeneity and its function. It's also driven by this presence or absence of geomorphic integrity. Is the river able to respond to changes in inputs like water and sediment? And I sometimes refer to leaky rivers. They become leaky, they lose that retention. So floods are transmitted downstream much more rapidly. Sediment, in many cases, very unfortunate contaminants are not stored or dispersed into the floodplain. They move downstream rapidly. So if you lose heterogeneity and retention, you end up with leaky rivers. Okay, I've learned to be patient. If I do this twice, I'll go maybe too patient. Let's see. There we go. Just a couple of examples, again, to reiterate that what I'm talking about refers to rivers of all sizes, smallest to the largest, A historic image of the Rhine. It's a painting, but you can see these forested islands. That would be an anastomosing river. This was this portion of the Rhine by the 1970s. It looks more like an interstate. And Danube in 1812 near the city of Austria, nice multi-channel system. And by 1991, there's still a little bit of floodplain diversity, but it's been simplified to a single channel. So I've talked about the functions, the implications of spatial heterogeneity. Just a couple briefly case studies that relates to river health, river function. Looking at valley bottom organic carbon storage, and one of the things that I've seen in the last 2 days is a lot of really rich organic rich bottom soils in many of the streams here in Wisconsin. And if you haven't been thinking about it, a lot of groups like the Nature Conservancy and other NGOs are thinking very seriously about using rivers for carbon sequestration and carbon credits. And I think, you know, you probably are familiar with wetlands as the carbon market for wetlands. I think that's going to start for rivers. It is starting already in some places. The idea that you can manage rivers to enhance carbon storage in floodplain soils. So we've been looking at floodplain carbon for a while. This is Nick Sutphin's PhD work. And working in mountain streams in the Rocky Mountain National Park, we found that these wide, low gradient portions of the river corridor that I sometimes refer to as river beads are less than a quarter of the total length of the river network. Otherwise, they're classic mountain rivers. They're steep, narrow, laterally confined. But those segments are very rich in carbon. They have wetland soils, basically, that in some places they're almost peat. They're up to 35% carbon. It's usually more like a 12 to 16% range, but that's a lot of carbon. And particularly in this environment that I work in, which is semi-arid conifer forests, it's 23% of the carbon in the total watershed, even though the 1%. So there's two things in there. One is that the floodplain soils are disproportionately important for carbon storage. The other is that some portions of the river corridor are disproportionately important. Those wide, low gradient areas that are beads. So if you're going to focus on something like carbon sequestration, focus on those portions of the river corridor. And another PhD student, Deanna Laurel, looked at beaver meadows. Again, I'm using this phrase to refer to those portions of the river corridor where there's multiple dams, ponds, and usually a multi-field channel. Those are great for attenuating downstream fluxes. They're 8% of the total carbon storage in the watershed now in Rocky Mountain National Park. Most of the beaver are gone, so these are features, and that's a function of being outcompeted by the elk and the moose that are grazing or browsing the riparian willows. But that value is closer to 23% when they're actively maintained. So I know there's a lot of controversy. A lot of people are either beaver or there's no value. There's good arguments on both. But if you want to enhance carbon storage, beavers are a very good way to do that. Second line of evidence, again, retaining things. So in-stream removing nitrate, increasing biomass. This was Bridget Liver's PhD. She was part of a multidisciplinary team where we were looking at the role of old growth forests. And I liked old growth for its own sake, but the more I learned about how old growth forest influences streams, the more I became a real fan of old growth. Old growth means larger trees, and when they fall into rivers, they're more likely to be stable and to trap smaller pieces of wood and form large log jams. So if you have more wood and more large wood and log jams, you get greater channel spatial heterogeneity. You get larger volumes of backwater pools. You get a lot of organic matter stored in those pools. You're more likely to have more hypereic exchange that enhances denitrification. You have organic carbon in the wood itself, and the wood, of course, is an obstruction that enhances channel floodplain connectivity. So you get more overbank flow that infiltrates into the floodplain, creates a high water table, saturated soils, and on and on. There's a whole series of feedbacks. You also get greater nutrient uptake because of the hypereic exchange and the denitrification. And we had ecology colleagues who were working on this. We didn't find more aquatic insects, but we did find a lot more biomass and diversity of their predators. So we were looking at trout and riparian spiders, and there was a very strong correlation with old growth forest and the associated stream complexity. Third line of evidence. This is from other work. Let's see if we can, there we go. The more spatially heterogeneous the river corridor, the more you have different pathways for water. So some goes down the main channel, some goes down secondary channels, overbank flow in the floodplain, subsurface flow, but you get a greater distribution of hydrologic residence times. This is from the Middle Fork Flathead River in Montana, which is a very well-studied system. If you have a greater diversity of hydrologic residence times, that means at least some of that water is really important, probably in terms of taking slow flow paths that promote things like denitrification or losing its sediment and promoting phosphate retention. And from that same site, somebody told me that this is a mouthful, the floodplain biogeochemical mosaic. It's just the idea that if it's spatially heterogeneous, you're going to have hotspots of carbon storage or hotspots of denitrification, which is what these two maps are showing for a length of river corridor. And this piece, this paper is an example of a study that quantified that. Here we go. Okay, so to step back and put this all in context, as I think John outlined very nicely, we don't have much old growth forest left anywhere in the world, and we're losing it even faster. So we've had this global loss of old growth forest. We continue to have active wood removal from river corridors. So globally, we've reduced forest cover by half. Old growth is almost gone. And at least in the Western US, it's going a lot faster now, not because of direct management, but because of the tremendous fires we keep having that's burning old growth. And I think many of you as ecologists are probably familiar with the term alternative states, the idea that you can have an ecosystem that can exist in two very different configurations and be stable in either one, but you need something to move it between them. So my highly technical terms for this with respect to wood are wood rich and wood poor. If you have some wood in a channel, that acts to trap other wood. So you can have a self-enhancing feedback where you can build up fairly large log jams. If you take all the wood out for log floating, for timber harvest, you create a less retentive system. And this tree that's leaning over here and about to fall in is less likely to be trapped in that channel than if there were some wood already present. Beaver, the estimates, this is an old estimate. I haven't seen anything updated, but something like 6 to 12 million now in North America, historically, maybe up to 400 million. And this is the most famous alternative state in terms of being described for river corridors, beaver meadows versus elk grasslands. So as long as the beaver are present, they're maintaining that spatial heterogeneity, that high water table, three-dimensional connectivity. If the beaver disappear, and this is a place in Rocky Mountain National Park where the elk have completely transformed it through intensive riparian grazing during the last 30 years, the dams disappear, the flow is likely to concentrate in a single channel that cuts down and widens, and you go to this much more well-drained meadow that's sometimes called an elk grassland. That's one example. There's a lot of things that we do. We have global flow regulation. There have been a whole series of papers that show that most of the world's rivers are heavily dammed, and this is the color coding here is indicating the degree to which they're altered. We have massive channelization levees, which haven't really been quantified very well, except in the US. This is a paper that just came out earlier this year. The point is, I think that the default assumption in most rivers, certainly in the continental US, should be that there's been a history of modification that's resulted in homogenization or simplification. So if we want to make them messy, and this was a deliberate reference to a silly movie, Dumb and Dumber, how messy do they need to be? What do we need to do? Well, again, it depends a lot on where you are in the watershed and in the world, and also what's possible. If you have an intensive land use history and you don't have old growth anymore, you can wait 200 years, or you can try and jumpstart that process by using things like engineered log jams or beaver dam analogs or whatever the management tool may be. But I think being very aware of the context of the portion of the river you're trying to manage is critical to think about what was there and what might be feasible to restore. And these are just 3 randomly chosen examples. They're all very natural, heterogeneous river corridors, but with very different processes and forms. One way to conceptualize this, so this is length scale on the y-axis going from the very small, like a single dune or ripple in a sandbed channel up to an entire watershed. Time scale on the X from something that changes over minutes to geologic timescales. At those geologic timescales where you're looking at the entire watershed, it's mostly things like climate and tectonics or geology that are controlling it. At the short to intermediate timescales, it's mostly us now. So it's deliberate by river engineering, or it's inadvertent through our land use and changes in land cover. And the net effect of those activities has largely been to reduce spatial heterogeneity. So I think much of what we can do to restore rivers is to focus on reintroducing some of that temporal and spatial heterogeneity. And this is more getting into research, but a lot of what we need to focus on now is numerical modeling. The hydraulics and hydrology community has made tremendous strides in the last 2 decades. It's pretty common now to use 2-dimensional hydraulic models. And when I started, 1-dimensional was all you could do. You looked at the water going downstream. You didn't think about it going laterally or vertically. We've coupled hydraulic and sediment transport models now. They're very spatially explicit. They're not that computationally intensive. We're just starting to do this for incorporating large wood or the effects of riparian vegetation. But ideally, we'll keep integrating these different components of river corridors so that we can quantitatively predict, well, what if I did this in this river? What might be the effects? We do that now with our expert judgment or best guess. But if we could do that with numerical predictions, then we could begin to quantify some of these 3-dimensional fluxes and whatever parameter it is that's of most interest to you, whether it's habitat abundance and diversity, biomass. We do this now with things like habitat suitability indices for fish, for example, but we're continuing to work on 3-dimensional versions of this. So coming back to this image that I showed you before, I'm hoping that you, if you don't already, will look at something like this and think of this in 3 dimensions, not just the longitudinal dimensions. Think of how those fluxes interacting with that context creates and maintains heterogeneity and some of these response variables like organic carbon stocks or nutrient uptake, and think of that as occurring in the context of a river corridor. Oops, well, river corridor flashed by. It was just a circle around it. So coming back to this drawing, I asked one of our grad students who's an artist to re-envision that picture on the left. And so now we've got a few more specific things. We've got a riparian forested corridor that would be appropriate for England, and it's got some diversity of age. It's got some large wood in there. There's a secondary channel across the point bar. There's a little bit more heterogeneity in the varial zone. I'm not sure what happened to the dog, but the boy's catching a fish. So I want to just end with this idea that what you expect, and you being not just us in this room, but the general public, what we expect, what we consider natural and appropriate and desirable, is critically important. And a lot of what we can do as river scientists is focus on outreach and encourage people to think about rivers not just as simple downstream flow, but as something much more complex. And I'll just give you, there's a couple of references that have looked at people's perception of rivers and how they govern management. Just briefly end with a case study from Switzerland. This is a river in the Alps in the Dolomites, naturally braided, huge amounts of sediment, coarse sediment coming in from the valley slopes. The Europeans in Austria, Germany, Italy, etc., Switzerland have spent centuries training these rivers, as they call it, channelizing them, stabilizing them. So here in 2005, this river has a lot of bank stabilization. Each of those white lines is a check dam, so it's a little grade control structure. And you can see the floodplain has a lot of land use. This portion of the river was chosen for a restoration project by the EU Water Framework Directive, and the nearby communities were very resistant. They did not want this to become a braided river. It went ahead. I was there in November 2018 on a miserable day. It was about 35 degrees and sleeting. That river corridor was full of people. They were watching birds, they were fishing, they were walking their dogs. It's won a prize now for river restoration, and the local communities are very proud of it, and they're trying to persuade downstream communities that they should do the same thing. So you can change people's perceptions and their expectations. It's a working together, not we'll tell you how it should be, but communicating in both directions, understanding what the resistance is to why don't people want to see a messier river, I think can be very useful. So I will stop there. Thank you very much.
How soon would they be available, Eric? Later this week, okay? Go back and look at the recording of